I see it's just after 12 o'clock, and I think we'll just jump in, and I'll start with introductions, and I know a few people will still be attending, but just wanted to say welcome to everybody. It's hard to believe it's mid-December already. I'm getting close to the holiday season. I just want to start first by acknowledging that Queens and all of us here are situated on the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territories, and just particularly grateful as we enter the holiday season and all the time that we'll be spending on these lands over the next couple weeks as we're off and enjoying our time here, or maybe hunkering down on these lands, but just wanted to say how grateful that we are. And I'm particularly also grateful that Paul has agreed to present today, and it's wonderful to have him. We've been talking about this for a couple months, so it's great that he's here. And for those of you who may not know Paul, Paul is a PhD candidate in epidemiology under the supervision of Dr. Heather Stewart in the Department of Public Health Sciences here at Queen's. Prior to coming to Queen's in 2017, Paul received a medical degree, and Paul, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Chulalongkorn?
Yep, perfect. Yep, Chulalongkorn University.
Excellent, in Bangkok, Thailand, and a master's degree in population health sciences from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, in the US. And Paul was born and raised in Thailand, and Paul wanted to turn his cross-cultural adaptations and experiences into a doctoral thesis that looks at ethnocultural factors and especially cultural identity clarity and how they might be associated with psychological well-being and stigma of mental illness. And the thesis, although mainly etiological in nature, but particularly given Canada's multiculturalism, thinking about how these findings can help inform how or if mental health services should take individual cultural identity or cultural groups into account. And Paul, I think this is extremely timely work as we think of ourselves and where we come from, particularly as we enter this holiday season. So really grateful for your talk today. Thank you. And before Paul gets started, it's probably about a 35-minute talk, and then we'll have time to take our cameras, put our cameras on, and have a conversation after.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. That was, really appreciate the introduction. So I'm gonna try to, I can't believe it's been like 2 years since I've been in this, and I actually have trouble every single time trying to share a screen. Okay, just wanna double check everybody sees. Okay, sounds good. All right, so just like what Catherine kind enough to introduce me. So my name is Paul Boonmak. Born and raised in Thailand, and now I'm doing a PhD degree at Queen's University with Dr. Heather Stewart, but she's here as well. So my thesis, looks at ethnocultural identity, psychological distress, and stigma of depression in university students. Like how it was described, most of the findings are etiological in nature, but again, there's a little bit of a policy flair that I try to, put into it and make it interesting, I think. Okay, so again, first of all, I'd like to also acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on the territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. So, as an uninvited settler, I am, forever grateful, and I feel really, I really appreciate that I get to learn the history of this land that dates back, thousands of years prior to European settlements. I'm also very grateful that, I get to, be present on this land, and I truly look forward to contribute back to the lands that I'm currently on. Okay, so this is, basically the subtopics that we'll be touching on today. So the first part will be a little bit of a review of the situations. Mainly, I will be talking about, Canada's multicultural situations and, and just laying the grounds in terms of like, why is it that I'm interested in the multicultural populations of Canada. And then now we'll dive into my thesis for a little bit. So, we'll start with the introduction of different concepts, mainly cultural identity clarity. We have, talk a little bit about ethnocultural groups and then other variables that went into my thesis, study methods, and then some main findings, and then, a little bit of policy implications and then conclusion and questions. Now, the conclusion part and questions are what I really look forward to. I'm seeing this more as an open discussion of gathering ideas and all these things. Again, I'm, pretty new to Canada. It's been 4 years. So learning about how things are done and, how things are going. So would really appreciate all the comments and everything. So see this presentation as like a little bit of a journey. So, if you're taking the metro, we have different stations. So if you look at the color on the top, it's gonna, take you all the way to the end. So, and the yellow part would be where, we're stopping. Okay, so we'll start with the overviews of situation. So Canada's ethnocultural diversity. So Canada is diverse. There's, no other way to say it. I think everybody knows. About 22% of Canadians are immigrants. That means that, we, and me being an immigrant as well, I'll just use we then. So we come from somewhere where we're not from Canada. And within those 22%, most of us also come from Asia, almost 50%. But that doesn't mean that we don't have other, immigrants from somewhere else. We have Europe, and immigrants from the Americas, Africa and Oceania as well. The reason why they're small because, the population in Oceania is, obviously very small. So they don't make up too much of a representation here in Canada. So now not only Canada is diverse, but Canadians themselves are very multicultural. So according to the census done in 2016, I couldn't find the ones that just was done last year, 41% of Canadians reported multiple ethnic origins. So it's not just, your English, your Anglophone, or your French, but your mix. Now, these are the top 10 ethnic origins that Canadians reported. Of course, number one, Canadian. Mostly, Canada have kept its, ethnic origins. So a lot of, people identify with being from the British Isles or have British Isles heritage. Also French is, a big part of Canadian heritage as well. But if you look at, there are some other growing, ethnic origins as well. Chinese is really becoming larger. Actually a little bit below the list, I think on the, let's say 13th, the ethnic origin, Filipino is also rising. So you see that Canadians are, like I said, are diverse, but Canadians are also becoming multicultural as well. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit before we go into the topics is that, what is the journey of immigrants, and then what do we know, about, and how does a journey of an immigrant relates to mental health status, right? So let's say that this guy here is an immigrant, he's coming to Canada. So that's why I put a little maple leaf on there. Immigrants usually have this thing that we call healthy immigrant effect. And that is because, in order for someone to make the decision to jump, onto a ship or a plane to come to another country, usually we're healthier. And it is because, and the process itself is, you need a lot of resilience, and you have, to be really determined, to be outside of where you're from. So generally, to start off, we're pretty healthy. And that includes, physical and also on the mental aspects of things as well. But as the journey goes on, when you settle into a new country, right, of course, there's so many factors that are going to affect your mental health or mental status. First of all, the big part is, acculturation, right? You have to adapt yourself. You have to adjust yourself being far away from home. Some of us don't speak English that well or French that well. So we do need to put a lot of energy into that. Acculturative stress, includes anything from having cultural support to finding a job, English proficiency or French proficiency. Sadly, we also face discrimination and some, microaggressions and all these things. It's just not, I guess it's nature to like a place that's, hyper diverse. Deep inside, and now it's coming in terms of individual level, we also struggle with identity issue as well, because, we carry a big part of us, from somewhere else, but then coming here, we have to adjust. And sometimes it's not easy to just let go of, a package that we have. And that also, that depends on the cultural background that you come from, what gender you are, that also affects, your mental health status, cultural support, like I said, and sexual orientation as well. So at the end, the healthy immigrant effect seems to diminish. And then, at the end, studies have found that, more or less we're comparable to other, like let's say Canadian-born, Canada-born Canadians, let's say. So if our mental health effects have, the healthy immigrant effect has diminished, that means that, we also are subject to, mental health issues and psychological distress and all that. So normally we think that we would seek help, right? So do we seek help? Actually, no. Immigrants are known to not seek help, and that, it's a number of reasons. One is that, the perception of mental illness, not, some cultures really do believe that having a mental distress is not something that's real. You just have to have a strong heart or strong mind to be able to go through all these, obstacles, right? We know that that's not true, but sometimes it's not, being translated well into, people from different cultures, and me included. I'm from Thailand, and we're part of Asia. It's known to be really highly stigmatized against people living with a mental illness, but not just individual barriers, but also societal barriers as well. Sometimes there's mistrust among the immigrant community. Also, you have to know English. Sometimes the services are not provided in the language that and let's say an immigrant is comfortable in. So these are things that bar immigrants from going to seek help. And at the same time, immigrants, we might have babies. These babies, I don't like the term, but the official term is probably called second generation immigrants. It is because they're technically not immigrants anymore because they were born here, but that's, the term that's been laid out. And second generation immigrants are known to also face what we call, multiple cultural identity, as in, there's always longing for the sense of belonging, let's say, because you grew up in one culture, right? In a household of one culture predominantly, but then you go out, you have to adjust yourself and then try to blend in with the larger Canadian context. So these are, lives of, of an immigrant, and you see how many things can be kind of stacked against them when it comes to mental health and mental status. Okay, so just to kind of, in conclusion of our situation, Canada is very diverse and Canadians are multicultural. Immigrants are mentally healthy or healthier when we first come, but then, due to a number of demographic and cultural factors made us a bit less healthy. We have less access or do not access mental health services as much. And second generation immigrants have multicultural identities that might affect their mental health status as well. All right. So we're going to turn those situations into my thesis. So it is unavoidable that new or current Canadians are exposed to multiple cultures. That's just how, the Canadian society is, right? We're very diverse. And for those who are multicultural, my question is having a clear sense of who one is culturally related to psychological wellness, right? And, there's a policy implication to that as well. Basically, I guess what we would be asking, encouraging one to have a good sense of who they are culturally, help with their psychological distress. So this is kind of how I'm seeing my thesis related to the policy side of things. So now we're moving on to the thesis, and this is the main kind of variable that I wanted to explore, right? So it's cultural identity clarity, and these things takes pages to write in terms of what it is and what are the concepts that come before it. So I'll just volunteer myself. So this is me. I am from Thailand. That's a Thai flag. My mom is of Chinese descent, and my grandmother is actually Fledgling Chinese. And I am currently living in Canada with my partner, who's from Quebec, and he is here as well. So hi, Fred. We, with these cultures, right, they come different languages and different customs, different ways of thinking and all that. I remember sometimes, when I say Canadians, a Chinese or a Thai, they're the same. For me, they're very different. And, their ways of thinking and meanings of, I look at a family, what does it mean to be a family in Chinese? What does it mean to be a family in Thai? So these things are always kind of, limits in terms of what I can be in the respective culture that I'm in. Now that's going to dictate how I act, right? Different cultures, different languages, and then different behaviors. So normally I'm fine. I compartmentalize myself. I go, when I'm in Thailand with my family, I act certain way, I think certain way. When I'm in Canada with my partner, I act certain way, and then I think certain way. But when these cultures kind of clash, I don't know who I am and what am I going to do anymore, right? Like let's say my parents are here with my partner, and then my in-laws are also here. Sometimes it's really difficult how to act, right? So, and then I get confused in terms of who I am. I don't have a very clear sense, right, of who I am anymore. So this is how I understand this cultural identity clarity. Now, this, I want to know if it affects, the psychological well-being of me, let's say, it's just because now that I'm using me, and also that, not only just the cultural identity clarity, but also the cultures themselves. How do the cultures that I have within me affect me? And me, it can be, how I see mental illness, basically translates to, stigma of mental health, of mental illness and all these things. So these are basically the two exposures that I have in mind. So cultural identity clarity and ethnocultural identity, right? So my thesis question is, are ethnocultural identity and cultural identity clarity associated with psychological distress and stigma of mental illness? Okay, so I have the exposures here, and then I have the outcomes here. This is very epi, oriented. But basically, we have exposures, we have outcomes, and then we gotta have confounders and effect modifiers, right? So these are some of the things that I thought, that I found that were related somewhat to either how someone is acculturated into, a new culture, or are they associated with, one of the outcomes that I have. So personally, someone living with mental illness, that is a big thing. It really shapes how you perceive, a person living with a mental illness. Undergraduate or graduate students and domestic and international students, I just, since I'm using, and this is a little bit of a pre-text before I'm diving into it, I'm using, a sample of university students. So I just want to make sure that I have, all the relevant demographic variables for, the population that I'm exploring. Also, domestic and international students have a little bit of the surface of a proxy too, because we know that having legal status of a person in a destination country actually affects a lot in terms of how well they integrate or acculturate into a new culture. Imagine if you don't have, a legal status in a country, it must be really stressful. While if you are more, stable, then you have, the time and the luxury to kind of go through with, whatever that you have to go through in a new country. Age, gender, sexual orientation, or identification as a member of a minority group, these things are known to affect, acculturation. So that's why we put them there, and then we'll see if they're going to act like a confounder or are they going to act like an effect modifier. Okay, so those were the concepts, and then now we move to the methods, right? So we had conceptualization, and then from which I just talked about, and then survey development, survey distribution, and then the analyses. We just talked about conceptualization. So I want to talk really briefly about survey development, right? So basically, these are the steps that I did. I'm not going to talk over all of them, but basically it's a matter of finding questionnaires, or make up ones that are not available, and then qualitatively assessing if it fits with, the target population, do some power and sample size calculations. These are really boring stuff. And then assessing the validity and reliability among our sample. So finding the questionnaires and make up the ones that are not available. I just want to show you that, the 4 factors that I have, the 2 exposures and 2 outcomes, I was able to find, questionnaires and made up, for the ones that are not available. So for example, ethnocultural identity, I just made up a question asking them, what ethnocultural backgrounds do you identify with? Now, those of us who are familiar with most census data, usually, or in research, ethnocultural research, I would normally be put into one category, Asian or Southeast Asian, that's it, right? But that doesn't reflect, the multicultural nature of Canada. So, but I made up my own question, and then I actually left them blank spaces. So then, for our participants to write any culture, ethnocultural background that they want. So they can write, Canadian, they can write Quebecois, they can write Thai, anything that they want. And then I was going to put them into, our analyses, right? And then for cultural identity clarity, I wanted to capture 2 things. One, multicultural identification. So basically, I just asked, do you self-identify as being multicultural? And we had some that did, we had some that didn't. And then the main player, so cultural identity clarity. I found a scale that was developed in Montreal called Cultural Identity Clarity Scale. So basically, it looks at, it's a bunch of statements, and then you kind of answer, whether you're comfortable with who you are, do your cultural backgrounds often clash with one another, and all these things. So basically, it measures how clear you are in terms of your cultural identities. Outcomes have 2 things: psychological distress. So if you are, positive on paper, either for depression or anxiety, then you're considered to be psychologically distressed. And then you have stigma of depression, and I used the depression stigma scale. Basically, we're looking at public stigma. So basically, how one perceives other people who are living with depression. Okay, and then I put all of them together, put them in a survey package, and then off it went. Now, analyses, right? So I want to talk really briefly about variable transformation. So again, these are the 2 exposures and 2 outcomes that I have. Ethnocultural identities, remember that I have blank spaces for people to write. So here's how I deal with that. So basically, they can write anything you want, and then I kind of expand it to a larger scale. So let's say if they're Canadian, right? I would just start with linking them to a country, and then a special variable that I use called the UN, so United Nations Geo Scheme. So basically, the UN divides the world into different, sub-regions. But they're not just geographical, but they take cultural factors into account as well. For example, in North America, Canada and the US are grouped together, but not Mexico. Mexico would be, considered in Central America with other nations that are more culturally homogenized, right? So that's the UN geo scheme, and there's a bunch of them. And then I went up to continent, and then an east-west dichotomy divide. So at the end, choosing the level that would not really compromise my power to analyze, I used the UN geo scheme. And then basically, let's say, someone identified as a Canadian, then I convert them all to dummy variables. So they would be positive for Northern America. If they say that they're Canadian and Chinese, then they would be positive for Northern America and Eastern Asia, for example. And that way, I think what's special about my research is that this way we really take into account, the multicultural nature of our participants by not just try to fit them into, one single cultural category. Okay, and then statistical models, psychological distress, like I said, I have positive or negative, so it's just binary outcome. The method that I used was a modified Poisson regression with robust error variance, and what we get is essentially a risk ratio. And then for stigma of depression, we have 4 categories. So what we did was we used ordinal logistic regression. So what we have is that we have odds ratios of moving from one, I guess, order to the higher order or something like that. Okay, so now this is the fun part. So this is our finding. So participants, we invited 4,215 Queen's students who are here for a degree. So they're not coming here to learn English, or they're coming, or the ones that went to the the campus in the UK. So basically, just the ones that are here. 750 responded. That's about 18%, which is what we were expecting. We were expecting 20%. That's usually what generally, what we can expect from an education, institution. And then we have 43% who identify as being monocultural, and then 56% identify as being multicultural. I want to point out 2 other stats. So in terms of psychological distress, you see that almost half of our, at least students in our sample are positive for, either depression, anxiety, or both, with 25% being positive for both depression and anxiety. And I think that's a little bit high to my liking. As in, I would like to see that, students here are happy. That's not always possible, but yeah, so it's pretty high. In terms of ethnocultural identity representation, we had 94 unique cultures, 13 UN geoscheme regions, and 5 continents. Number 1, of course, is Canada. It's so much that I kind of ignore them and give them a 0. And then, but otherwise, we have Chinese, Indian, and American for first, second, and third. This actually kind of reflects the enrollment report that Queen's University has. I'm not going to go and say that, our sample is representative of Queen's students, but at least in terms of looking at the bigger picture, they look like, it's following the trend. Okay, so outcome number 1, psychological distress, right? So I'm going to list to the y-axis here, cultural identity clarity. And what I did was that I divided them into 4 quartiles. So the first quartile represents those who are least clear of who they are culturally. And then the 4th quartile is those who are most clear culturally. So a little bit of a 2-sided arrow just to help visualize. And then for the x-axis, we have the risk ratio, basically. This is a risk ratio of being psychologically distressed, right? And then I have a little dash line here for the risk ratios of 1. And the reference group is our monocultural students. So your students who only identify with one culture. And this is the risk ratios that we have. You see that if you are least clear on who you are culturally, your risk of being psychological distress is actually higher. Odds ratio is about 1.3, 1.4, and it was significant. You also see a little bit of a dose response relationship as well. Interestingly, if you're multicultural and you're clear on who you are culturally, it's almost like a protective factor. Again, our sample size might not be able to lead us to that strong of a conclusion, but it looks like there's something there, right? If you are multicultural, but you're not clear, then you're more likely to be distressed. But if you're multicultural and you're clear on who you are, then you will probably have better psychological well-being than compared to monocultural students. So again, in words, students with no cultural background who are least clear about their cultural identity are associated with higher risk of psychological distress compared to those who identify with just one ethnocultural group. Okay, so that was outcome number one. And we have outcome number two, which is stigma of depression. Again, on the y-axis, I have different cultural groups, right? And then you'll see some of them that I actually had to combine because of sample size, consideration. And then again, on the y-axis, we have odds ratios. Again, these are the odds, of holding a higher level of stigma. So if the odds are high, that means that they're more likely to have higher level of stigma against people with depression. So again, this is the reference level of one. And the first one I want to show is that these are the odds ratios for domestic students. You see that they're hanging around one, right? Again, that none of them actually deviate from one significantly. But now look at international students. I just want a big picture for now, as in it's clear that they act differently. Cultural groups, they act differently, whether a student is a domestic student or an international student. And you see, not naming any cultural groups, you see that some groups are higher than others. Some groups are actually lower than others. I mean, I'm part of the, a higher group, like from East and Southeastern, Asian student. That's me, international students. I'm one of those dots. So, so you see that cultural groups act differently, whether you're domestic students or international students, when it comes to holding a stigma of depression. So again, in words, the odds of having a higher level of stigma change with different ethnocultural groups among international students, but not in the domestic student group. Okay. There are some other findings as well that I found was, pretty interesting. For psychological distress, non-heterosexual identifying students are associated with higher risk of being psychologically distressed. So I'm talking, non-heterosexual identifying students or, LGBTQ students with a risk ratios of 1.3. And then for stigma of mental illness, male identifying students, so male students, have higher odds of holding a high level of stigma for depression, and the odds ratios are pretty high, 2.1. And those who do not personally know someone, with a mental illness, have higher odds of holding a higher level of stigma, and the odd ratios are really high, 3.27. And this one is probably one of the most, one of the strongest associations that we found overall when it comes to stigma of mental illness. And it's funny that because, well, it's not funny, but interesting that it takes someone to know, or to have an experience to change their point of view. But I guess, that's just how it is, right? But it really shows that, a lot of people are experiencing mental illness, but at the same time they hold stigma because they don't know that other people are experiencing the same thing that, that we're going through. Okay, so now on to policy implications. We're almost there. Our train is almost to the terminal station. So policy implications. Again, I love trains, so I'm gonna do it in this fashion, I guess. So I was thinking of how I'm gonna frame this. So I would just, take on the classic public health interventions, public health preventions. So we have primary preventions, secondary preventions, and tertiary preventions, right? So primary preventions being, we just want to promote good mental health, good mental well-being for everyone, so that no one develops, depression or anxiety ever. And then secondary prevention is when someone is, has already have depression, but we need to detect them early enough so that we can move them into tertiary prevention, which basically is treatment, so therapy or medication or something like that, right? So across the board, I think all the preventions, they need to be culturally sensitive and inclusive. It looks like, especially when Canada is very multicultural and diverse like this, it's not a question of saying them and us, because if 1/5 of Canadians are from somewhere else, we might as well call everyone a we, because we as, people who live in Canada, we are very diverse. We're all one. There's no they or, or us. Also need to promote sense of self and identity. And this is from our findings, that those who are clear on who they are culturally, then they're more likely to be, better off, not better off, but end up with better mental well-being. Given the findings that that we got, the main ones, and also the extra ones that I just presented, I think we also need to consider some subgroups and intersectionality, because let's say that, not only that they target immigrants, but let's say LGBTQ immigrants or female immigrants, I think we all experience things very differently, and the way that we kind of act or behave or think about mental illness are very different as well. So I think all of them need to consider these things, into mind. For primary prevention, this is some suggestions that I think, health promotions, we might consider health promotions that address specific issues in a cultural group. And this is from the stigma piece that I saw, right? How ethnocultural groups, even though, we look the same, we look Asian, but the fact that you are domestic or you're international makes a difference. So I think we need to look at specific issues in terms of what's going on in that specific subgroup in order to have, proper, and targeted interventions and preventions. Secondary preventions, I think what's most important, and this would be beneficial to all immigrants, is that we probably should consider active reach out programs. And just because it's really hard for, to change a mindset of someone to all of a sudden be very accepting of, oh yeah, I have mental illness, so I have depression, so I'm just going to go see, a psychiatrist. It doesn't always work like that. So I think we need to be a little bit more active when it comes to trying to bring people in, not just waiting for, people to come in. And then in terms of treatment, I think, it's the best way to do is to look at a person as a person, look at a person as a whole. Treatment should be individualized, and, also support system, supports, or interventions that don't apply culturally to, to a patient or a client, that would be a waste of time because they wouldn't adhere to, treatment as well. So also I was looking around if there are examples out there of, different programs that have done this. My feeling, it's really hard to find anything that's more, systematic, as in, this is a mental health approach that the whole province of Ontario used or something like that. It looks like that it might exist. I just couldn't find them for this presentation. But I was looking for individual ones. For example, in New Zealand, there's a they looked at associations between cultural identity and mental health outcomes among the Maori youth in New Zealand. So the Maoris are, the indigenous peoples native to New Zealand. Also found something very similar to what I did. If these Maori youth, if they are, clear, if they have a sense of who they are, they're proud of who they are, then they're less likely to be psychologically distressed. So, and I think that is just a good health promotion. That means that, we probably should, promote, again, like self-representation in, media or in whatever that, we can, so that people feel like this is their home and then they can be proud of who they are. I was also looking at this, a little bit of practicality assessment paper looking at a community-based intervention for mental health for American Indian youth and their families. Again, I also want to acknowledge that now that I said, both of these studies, I know that Indigenous people suffer very differently from what immigrants, have to go through. And then we're very different in terms of, political, treatment and how the general public perceive the populations. But I just want to point out that at the end, it's adhering to the culture that you identify with that's going to, be very beneficial when it comes to mental health care. And now, there's also an outreach program. I think this one was done in Toronto. I'm not sure, but see, this is an outreach program for, not only for immigrant, but immigrant women. So like I said, there are specific programs that should be, targeted to bring people into, well, I wouldn't say the system, but to kind of, seek care and know that, this is also like a way to kind of treat or look after yourself or, take care of your mental illness as well. So these do exist. And then, there's a big talk about cultural competency practices as well. So this would more apply to, therapists or, like psychiatrists, where, these are specific programs that train psychiatrists and therapists to see culture, to be aware of the cultural identities that are behind, each and every client that, comes through your, clinic door and all that stuff. So all in all, they do exist. From the policy point of view, I think they're not very, as of now, they're not coherent and they're not uniform. I do know that at Queen's, for example, there's a cultural counselor and I actually have been in contact with her when I first moved here and, talk about different things. And I really love that. Like, I feel like, when there's someone that will, try to, get you to understand yourself as well and know that you're accepted and that, there's a place for you, in Queens and all. So, yep, in conclusion, we're at our last stop. So multicultural individuals have different level of clarity when it comes to, ethnocultural identities. My research found that unclear cultural identity associated with psychological distress. Using a post-secondary population, levels of stigma related to depression vary across ethnocultural group, but only among international students. So moving forward, I guess I would, if I can humbly suggest or talk about it, that mental health services probably should be culturally sensitive, inclusive, and primary intervention should be culturally specific. I'd like to thank Dr. Hezzer-Stewart, always being the best supervisor any student can ever ask for and imagine. And thank you, Kevin, for the opportunity. Thank you for trusting me with, with presenting my work. And also in terms of funding, I'd like to thank the government of Ontario and Queen's University for paying me to do this work through their Ontario Trillium Scholarship and also the International Tuition Awards. All right, and yeah, I'll take any questions, but again, I see this more as like a discussion so we can kind of, share ideas and all that. But anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. I must say, I love the train station slides. I'm like, I gotta borrow those.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I love trains, and so I just put everything I like into a presentation.
It's a great way to organize it. That was so interesting. I made actually quite a few notes because there were so many things that I was thinking about, both from a research, but also from an education perspective, at Queen's. And I was just thinking, I'm glad this talk is being recorded because I would really love to share it with some student services because I think it would be really insightful for them, as you talk about, how do you develop culturally specific programs and target different people in different ways to support them. I'm just going to ask you your thoughts. The one finding I thought was so interesting, those students who come from a multicultural background that had clear cultural identity basically had a protective factor. What do you think that is, and how do you think, what do you think offers that? How do you think they get that?
So I do think it has to do with, I don't know if it's the right word, but resilience. And I kind of experienced that myself. So I'll talk about myself first, but then I'm sure there's some theories that kind of backing me up. If when you're exposed to different things, it's like you're learning new things all the time, right? But it can be overwhelming at first. You're here, and then you like myself. Like when I moved from the U.S. to Canada, I was a little bit actually. I don't know what I was expecting, but I felt like I wasn't fitting in, and I don't know why. And I was like, because Canadians, from the outside perspective, are very similar to Americans. And when I say that, Canadians be like, no, but like I kind of felt it a little bit, and I guess it was because of having to adjust and learn new things. But once you kind of incorporate everything into you, it's much more comfortable. Like I feel like I can be, and then slowly I take into my, like I'm gay, so like I put in, my I'm not afraid to be who I am, and slowly opening up, and then feeling more content in terms of being who I am. And that is because I got to learn from different cultures, and then everything kind of like I don't have to choose sides. Like I know that this is me, and I can just talk about different things to different people, Thailand, here or otherwise. That's how I think it, and I do think that it has to do with resilience because, like I said, like you're more used to how different things are doing, and then that helps you with managing yourself and your mental health status and all that too.
No, it's really interesting. I actually have a whole bunch of questions, but I don't want to monopolize it all. Paul, do you mind stop sharing your screen? I'm just thinking, and people, if they have some questions, they can take themselves off mute and potentially on camera. As everyone knows, I will keep talking if no one stops me. It can be you and I having a conversation. Because I'm thinking, particularly from an education perspective, we're always, and the research shows, particularly in clinical students, the more they can be exposed to different perspectives again, this idea of, getting to know somebody who has a mental health condition. You're saying like that is the biggest stigma, 3.27, the odds ratio. That is striking to me.
Yeah.
And just, the stigma of coming out, so people acknowledge a sort of common experience. And, in our placements, when we have students in the OT program, we know that if people get to know people with different disabilities, the stigma breaks down. Do you think from like a university program perspective, like as from a university perspective, is there ways that we could do better to, have people understand mental health conditions and the experience?
One thing I actually, and I've been doing this, for the classes that I TA, is that, especially for mental illness, is that we do mental health checks, and it's not just to make sure that you're doing okay or to detect if someone is struggling or anything like that, but it's just to talk. I mean, I know that, Heather, for example, is working with the Bell Let's Talk program, and they're great in terms of like, encouraging people to talk, because then when we talk, we're like, okay, yeah, everybody's, we're going through very similar things. It's not like I'm the one, the only one who's, struggling and having, all these suppressed moods and all that. But I do think that the big change would be from changing the culture of talking about mental health, talking about disability as a whole, right? We should not be scared to talk about it. Again, like I have another quite personal example. My brother has intellectual disability, and and when a kid is born in intellectual disability, it comes with all kinds of mental health issues. He had mood disorder. He also has a little bit on the autism spectrum and all that. And my whole childhood and my family has been keeping it a secret, like cannot talk about it. But now that that I'm here and we get to talk about it, it's and I know some family with very similar stories and all this, and then I feel like, hey, you know what? It's not something that we should be keeping secret. There's nothing to be ashamed about it at all. Like, because it's gonna it's not both ways. People without the experience, and also people with experience. There should be a platform to to get to talk and be open about all the things. So as much as I do believe that a bigger policy will help change the culture, I do think that change comes from the individuals when it comes to breaking down stigma, especially for mental illness, for sure.
No, really interesting. Simone, I'm picking on you because you have your camera on. I don't know if you had a question.
I do have a question, but I'm not sure if you did talk about this, Paul. I was wondering if there was a difference between undergraduate and graduate students.
We didn't find any difference between the two. Yeah.
My other question too.
Okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Paul. Sorry, I interrupted.
Oh, no, I was going to say that, yeah, like in the main ones, they weren't significant. I was thinking that there should be, I was expecting a difference, and it's because the nature of graduate and undergraduate works are very different. The thing that I think might have confounded it was that in the graduate level, at Queen's at least, there's a lot more international students. So I think that in itself might have, the both of the effects combined, or one confounded the other, that we don't really see the effect of graduate versus undergraduate students anymore.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I would have thought the same, that there would have been differences as well. Thank you.
Which leads me to my other question too, Paul, just thinking like this was done in a university population, and just thinking would you expect similar results if this was, broadly taken from a sort of population of adults, for instance, or even younger kids? Like I'm just thinking like the older kids and then like high school.
That's the thing. I actually have no answer to that. I was thinking about it a lot, and if I say that it would be a little bit of a, overly optimistic. I do think that, and it is because post-secondary education institutions are very niche. When you look at the Canadian population as a whole, I don't think it will apply to a larger context, or not seamlessly. I do think, though, that it will be similar across all, populations that are around the same age as university students, and that's because the experiences are very, very similar. The other thing that our research couldn't capture, because since we use university students, is that these concepts are, they all have good level of English, and that's because, in order for them, and that's a barrier. Like, in order for them to get here, they have to, pass. I had to pass a TOEFL, but to prove that I can speak English and know English, right? So there's that barrier. So all of them has been pre-selected to be able to understand the survey and also understand the concepts, and not having to spend too much time adjusting when it comes to, linguistic barriers. So I think that's one of the biggest thing that, needs to let. If I'm going to apply this to a larger audience and a larger population, I need to jump over, that barrier.
Yeah, those are all really good points that I wasn't sort of thinking about as you were talking, but I can see how important this work is, though, at the university level, although it is a very unique group, because it's such a challenge now, growing diversity, but also more importantly, the growing mental health issues that students are facing, and like really getting a handle on this, as educators in the classroom to understand this, but then also the policies, at the student support services level as well. Yeah. What struck me is just the high levels of mental health reports that you had received. Yeah. Like, it is shocking.
It's to a point where, I think it might be because of, this is a separate story, but, during this summer, I TA'd, like an online course for Queens too, it's arts and sciences online. So basically we ran tutorials, and this was, 3 times a week. Every single tutorial, there would be someone that broke down, and, that we had to, like, go to a separate room and then, talk through, what's happening and how can I help and all these things. So it's getting worse, but I think COVID is also kind of pushing people, to the edge as well, in terms of having to deal with stress and the level of, driving people into bad mood and depression and bad places and all these. But yeah, I do think that just from the 4 years that I've been here, I see a trend. And like I said, this is anecdotally just me observing, the different student population that I get to interact with. But it is becoming more and more common.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, giving tools to instructors, to think how they can support different students differently within the classroom, recognizing its experience differently. I think it's really important. Elliot, you have your camera off. I don't know if you had a question.
Not so much a question, just a comment, Paul. Great study. Really interesting to see, especially in the light of, so many mental health issues being predominant. I know with Heather's work, a big focus of her, Let's Talk, has been to really educate the public about mental health issues. And I can't help but see that linkage between the results of your study, wherein the people who are familiar with mental health or who have had contacts with it, that seems to provide some level of protection, or it just seems to align nicely with her policy. I don't know, you've obviously had many chats with hers. Have you had much receptivity within the Queen's environment to pushing that on a policy level, that this should be a strategy that Queen's does?
I think I have to turn that to Heather, if you'd like to comment, Heather.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul.
Sorry.
For passing the buck. Actually, Queens has adopted the Okanagan Charter, and that means that they should be approaching everything they do from a health perspective, and health includes physical space, mental health, physical health. And I think that even though they've adopted it, I don't think anybody has a very clear idea of how to do it and what to do. So, everybody talks about culturally sensitive care, but what would you do to help people provide culturally sensitive care? Is it enough that they just know that certain cultures understand illnesses differently, or do they have to express empathy and humility towards those cultures? And how do you train people to do that? And so I think Paul has just finished well, weeks ago. So we haven't really had a chance to leverage any of these findings. Whenever I've done work, though, I've always found the wellness people quite open to doing things. And so I think once his exam is over, which hopefully will be early January or late January, we do need to do some knowledge translation. And I think universities and colleges right across the country are grappling with the same issues. And so I think maybe what we need to do is think about, what does culturally sensitive care look like? And maybe we should put some of that in your discussion, Paul, and think about the tools that people need to do it. I know whenever we do mental health work with faculty, they most of the time don't feel that's their responsibility, and they back away right away. They won't go to classes. We can't make it mandatory for them. We've had so many examples where when we do surveys, they say, you know, the university takes a risk when they admit people with mental illnesses, and it's not my responsibility to do anything about it. We have to change that mentality as well, because the faculty, the TAs, the residence people, the DONs are in the best position to identify a student who's struggling. And there are gatekeeper programs out there now that you can learn. If you know that a student is somebody is struggling, here's what you can do to get them through the right door, and here are the doors that are available. So there's a lot yet that needs to be done, but it's good that people are starting to think about it and starting to realize they don't have magic bullet solutions. So I think something really creative is going to ultimately come out of all of this.
Yeah, good points, Heather. I know it's really hard in my work that the key piece is how to get some of these research findings embedded into policy and to actionable concrete strategies that have an effect with your end user.
Yeah, I think you just have to have them involved from the outset. And what we tend to do is we involve people who have mental illnesses in as many aspects of research and policy development and planning as we can. And they have the ability to change cultures just by being in the room. And, it's to change the way you speak about certain things. You change the way you think about people who have an illness. You understand that they have leadership skills and that they're not, of a lower intelligence to some of the stereotypes that float around. So I think when we do that with policymakers, we get better traction as well. But it's a really time-consuming process, and most grants don't give you enough money to do it.
Yeah, those are all good points, Heather. Good questions. When you say this, I wrote it down, Heather, like, what does culturally sensitive care look like? And I think that is so interesting, sort of as the next step to sort of really conceptualize the findings. And I would say, as Heather's sort of pushing us to do, thinking about that, like, what would that look like at the instructor level? What questions could we ask classes that are general, but, start to break down stereotypes for multiple different people from perspectives, and also at the more university level. I think that would be interesting. Caroline, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, I just wanted to comment on the piece about cultural competency. I'm an upper year undergraduate student, actually, and I just joined because my supervisor, Dr. Amrita Roy, she shared this link with me, and I was just really interested. I'm conducting a study right now. We called it the Full Circle Queens Indigenous Student Wellness Study. It's one of my first experiences with research, so it's not super robust or anything, but we're really looking at, I'm an Indigenous student, and I was interested in how Indigenous students at Queens are experiencing and utilizing the wellness services here. So we partnered with 4 Directions Indigenous Student Center and Student Wellness Services, and we developed just a Qualtrics survey originally. And with our results, we're hoping to conduct sharing circles using an Indigenous research paradigm to, explore the topics or the themes that we are finding from our survey, just in more depth, in a more qualitative setting. And when we're talking about cultural competency, we are finding that when we're talking about empathy and things like that, we found that around 18% of our participants said that their holistic wellness needs were either invalidated or ignored at student wellness services. So, there's just this piece missing, and we're hoping that we can find recommendations or, a way forward to improve those experiences. And of the around 500 self-identifying Indigenous students who are enrolled at Queens, we received around 120 responses. So we're working with those answers. And a lot of people within our open-ended questions are saying, without this culturally appropriate care, we feel like we're lacking acknowledgement of our whole selves. And we thought that was really interesting. So I just wanted to comment because I think it's really relevant, and I was really excited to join this talk because it's a learning experience and also a really interesting topic.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for joining us and sharing that really interesting work with Dr. Roy. I'm keen to hear more, actually. We should follow up together. I know that I work with Amrita in a few things, and I know Heather has her hand up. She might have a comment actually to what you're saying.
Yeah, it's I teach a course on mental health topics, and one of the first things we do in the course is think about what does mental health mean and what does mental illness mean. And we go through some of the definitions from the Public Health Agency of Canada, from WHO, and universally they do not include an Indigenous perspective. They don't include things like spirituality, communing with the land, being, all of that is left out of all of our formal definitions of health and wellness. So I'm not surprised to hear Carolyn's comment that people who are trained to provide health and mental health services don't have the full perspective. They've been taught a certain way, and those critical pieces are missing out of all the definitions.
Yeah, no, and this is excellent. And Caroline, I really appreciate that. And Heather, that perspective is too, as I'm just thinking, as curriculum developers, I'm just looking at Dorothy, who's on the line here, in some of the health programs that we have in Queens, how can we better bring that into our training? How we understand mental health, mental illness, and Caroline, how can we be better to deliver services that are culturally sensitive? If you ever want to come and talk to our program, we would love to have your perspective.
No, I really appreciate that. And I'm still learning the whole research curve. So I'm lucky to work with Dr. Roy and our partners at Four Directions, because we're actually finding too that when Paul spoke about resiliency and that how a protective factor is connection to culture, a lot of our participants said they felt more comfortable at Four Directions just simply because there was a piece missing at Student Wellness, and there was informal relationships that they had with the staff at Four Directions and a whole community, that even if they weren't meeting the cultural counselor there formally, it's a space where they go sit and they connect with other students and informally with staff. So there was just that piece where they're more comfortable at Four Directions just naturally.
That's excellent, Caroline. I see we have one last question, then we'll wrap up. This was a great discussion, Paul. Thank you for leading it. And Mir Sanan, you have your hand up.
Hello, everyone. I'm a first-year Master of Public Health student, and I was really interested in Paul's research, and I wanted to join. So thank you, everyone, for having me. I would just also like to comment regarding the fact that I recently took the Intercultural Awareness Certificate training through Queen's University International Center. And there, like students and people from different cultures, they came together. We practiced the CAP, knowledge, attitude, and practice, guidelines. And we were often having this discussion where we were like, can culture really be explored in just 5 sessions? What's the best way to explore culture? What's the best way to become culturally sensitive? And one of the things Paul talked about in terms of multiple cultural identity, like when we are in situations where we are not sure, should we act in a Canadian way or in a Southeast Asian way? So how do we really deal with that? We cannot really change ourselves from who we are. The only way to go about is to know ways to be more sure of ourselves. So yeah, I think that's one of the ways we can develop. One of the things after I came to Queen's University, one of the things I loved about Queen's is that Queen's is trying its best to come up with programs and provide resources to students, to instructors, to everyone, and we still need to get better at how to design these programs. So Paul's research will definitely help with that, and hopefully in future we will all be able to like work together to come up with better ways of becoming sure of ourselves, I guess. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a wonderful way to end. I think that's exactly the direction we would love to go in. And thanks for sharing that. And I'm keen to find out more about that program. And Paul, just thank you so much. What a great way to end the series for the 2021. And thank you very much, Paul.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks, Paul. That's wonderful. Bye-bye, everybody.